Good afternoon, and welcome to New America. I know we'll continue to see more people trickle in and like to welcome our audience online as well. I'm Laura Bornfriend, Director of Early and Elementary Education Policy here at New America. And once again, thanks to everyone joining us for this important discussion about what schools and communities can do together to improve teaching, learning, and care in children's first 10 years. Before I go much further, I want to thank the Education Development Center for partnering on today's event. We're thrilled to be hosting this conversation, and thank you to the Heising-Simons Foundation for their support of this event. For those of you who are watching online, and those of you who'd like to participate in the conversation via Twitter, use the hashtag #First10. And for those of you who are interested in other events on topics related to early education, please consider coming back or tuning in again on Thursday morning for a discussion on early childhood educator diversity. And finally, be sure to check our early and elementary education policy homepage at newamerica.org/earlyed for all of our content that our program produces. Some of you may not be as familiar with New America. Our organization strives to explain and uncover the implications, both the challenges and opportunities inherent in a time of tremendous technological and social change. In our education policy program, we focus on equity for underserved students while also taking a broad view, examining learning environments and public education systems of all kinds, starting with our littlest ones and continuing up through adulthood. Our early and elementary education team works to help ensure that all children have access to a system of high-quality early learning opportunities from birth through third grade that prepare them to thrive in school and in life. Science shows that the early years are critical to the healthy development of a child's brain, and the skills developed in these years have cascading effects that enable children to become successful adults. We also know that more than 1 in 5 young children are living in poverty. High-quality early learning experiences and stable, nurturing relationships with adults can mitigate the harmful effects of poverty. Yet, the children who benefit most from high-quality opportunities in their earliest years are the least likely to receive them. And things don't often get better for many children when they enter kindergarten. In fact, across the country, kindergarten and the first through third grades lie in a policy dead zone, meaning states and school districts often pay little attention to the quality of teaching and learning experiences during these critical years of children's schooling. According to some research, only 7% of students receive consistently high-quality experiences in their first, third, and fifth grade classrooms. And this is particularly problematic for young students of color in high-poverty schools who are the least likely to have effective teachers with the resources they need. What can be done to improve children's early learning experiences? Well, in a few minutes, we'll hear from David Jacobson, Principal Technical Advisor at the Education Development Center, who just released today a new paper that offers a new approach to children's first 10 years, especially for children in undervalued and underserved communities. He will highlight some promising efforts in a few communities across the country. I'll let David tell you more. After David presents...
I definitely...
Okay, some noise from the back. After David presents, Christina Samuels, Associate Editor at Education Week, will come to the stage and moderate 2 panel discussions. I'll let her introduce the panelists when it's time, and for more details about this afternoon's program, please reference the agenda and bios you picked up on your way in. Once again, thank you for joining us today, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming David Jacobson.
All right. After you.
Thank you, Laura. It's a pleasure to be here. As Laura said, today I'll be talking about my new research study, All Children Learn and Thrive, Building First 10 Schools and Communities. This study focuses on an emerging reform strategy, a new wave of innovative work to improve children's experiences during the first decade of their lives. In different places across the country, schools and early childhood organizations are working together to improve teaching and learning, deepen family partnerships, and provide comprehensive services to children and their families. These are ambitious initiatives, as I think you'll hear about today. In some cases, these initiatives are centered around elementary schools and nearby early childhood centers and family child care providers. And in others, school districts are partnering with early childhood programs and extending this work across a larger geographic area, such as a town, a city, or a county. Taken together, these initiatives suggest a framework and a roadmap for improving education and care throughout the first 10 years. None of this research, however, would have been possible without a great deal of help. I'd like to thank Laura and New America for organizing and hosting today's panel, and Laura for being an important thought partner throughout the whole process. This project was funded by the Heising Simons Foundation. I'm grateful to our program officer, Rebecca Gomez, and to the foundation for its support. And I very much want to thank Christina Samuels and all of our panelists today. I'm looking forward to hearing their reactions and their thoughts. I thank them and the 16 other early readers of the report for what was really enormously helpful feedback. I'm grateful to Kyle DeMayo Cook and all my colleagues at the Education Development Center for their many contributions. And finally, I thank the well over 100 teachers, principals, and community leaders across the country who shared their experiences with me. Laura and I could have easily added many more communities to the panel. We successfully resisted that impulse, and we are excited to highlight today the work underway in Nebraska, Oregon, and Massachusetts. So as I mentioned, I work at EDC, the Education Development Center. EDC is a nonprofit organization that focuses on education and health, both here in the US and internationally. We have about 1,300 employees in total and about 80 staff working in early childhood and elementary school education and care. Now, I'd like to set the stage by grounding the initiatives I studied in a widely accepted assessment of early childhood education and care in the United States. We have decades of research on the science of early childhood that demonstrate a striking contrast between what children need in order to learn and thrive in the early years and their experience participating in programs and services. Children need consistent quality sustained throughout this critical developmental period. They need alignment across the years, meaning that every year we are building on and taking advantage of what children learned the previous year. For example, kindergarten needs to build on the learning and care that children experience in pre-kindergarten. And children need for the programs and services they experience each year to be coordinated, meaning coordination between education, health, and social services. Unfortunately, however, the programs and services that serve young children and their families in the United States are highly fragmented. There are gaps between public and private programs, often large gaps between 0 to 5 education and care and K-12 education and care, and gaps between education, health, and social services. And so what children experience is inconsistent quality, gaps across the age span, and a lack of coordination at each stage of development. In response to this state of affairs, 2 education reform movements have emerged or reemerged over the last couple of decades. One movement is the prenatal through grade 3 or P3 movement, which focuses on improving quality across the full continuum and aligning instruction across the age span. The focus here is on teaching and learning. Another movement is the community schools movement and related initiatives to provide comprehensive health and social services to children. Schools partner with health and social service agencies to ensure that children and families receive the services they need. What I think is really important and interesting is that these 2 movements are converging. There is a new wave of initiatives across the country that are drawing from both the P3 and comprehensive supports movements. Both of these movements set a high priority on family engagement and both are committed to educational equity and are focused on serving low-income families and families of color. This combination, I argue, is an important development. We know from the research that this is what's needed to address opportunity and achievement gaps. In my view, this combination is sufficiently distinctive and sufficiently backed by the research to warrant its own name, something other than P3 plus comprehensive services. So I follow two well-known early childhood experts, Arthur Reynolds and Judy Temple, in defining early childhood as roughly the first decade of life. And I use the term first 10 to refer to the combination of improving teaching and learning in the early years, strengthening family partnerships, and comprehensive services. And one of the benefits of using first 10 to refer to these initiatives is that it makes it really clear that this work is about a collaboration between school districts and elementary schools on the one hand, and other early childhood organizations on the other. Further, what I have found in this research is that some elementary schools are really adopting this approach as part of their identity. And for these schools, it's really become part of a whole school change effort. I've sat across from many principals and many family coordinators who've told me that the instructional practices and the family supports that they're putting into place don't stop at third grade. Now, there are two features of this combination of strategies that I want to make explicit. The first is the commitment to educational equity that I mentioned. The goal here is that all children receive what they need in order to develop to their full academic and social potential. Doing this requires eliminating disparities based on income, race, and other factors. Each of these communities that will be on our panel today have made significant financial investments in this work. And in each case, the primary focus of the work is on supporting low-income children and their families and children of color and their families. In these three cases, and in most of the cases in this report, the funding that supports the work is public in nature. Although in a couple of cases, philanthropic funding has played an important role as a catalyst seeding innovative initiatives. So a second point is that this convergent first 10 approach acknowledges a fundamental interdependence between schools, families, and communities. The success of each is integrally bound up with the success of others. Schools and communities are working both internally to improve the quality of teaching and learning and the quality of the services they provide, and externally as they deepen their collaboration with families and with each other. So here are the research questions that my study was intended to address. This study is what we call formative implementation research. It's an exploratory study. We know that these are evidence-based practices. We have a number of formal, rigorous evaluations that show that we're headed in the right direction. And several of the initiatives I describe in the study are currently being formally evaluated by outside organizations. This study is asking, what can we learn from how communities are implementing this work that will help them and other communities improve implementation? And then we'll have more formal evaluations and we'll see how they do. I began this work with a national scan of experts to identify appropriate communities. I conducted phone interviews with 18 communities, and I did site visits in these 6. And one of the first things we learn when we go out into the field and we look at this work is that it takes 2 basic forms. There are 2 basic first 10 structures. One type of first 10 initiative takes place at the level of a single elementary school, and it's nearby families, early childhood centers, Head Start programs, and family child care providers. I refer to this as a first 10 school hub. Some hubs focus more on direct support to families with young children, while others focus more on working with nearby early childhood centers and family child care. A second type of first 10 structure is a community partnership. And the big difference here is that this structure covers a larger geographic area, maybe a whole district or a zone within a district or even a county, and it includes multiple elementary schools, all the Head Start programs and early childhood centers within that area, all the family child care providers, et cetera. And then you may wonder, the question naturally arises, are these mutually exclusive? Could a community do both? And the answer is yes. This is what this would look like. Note the hubs within the larger community partnership circle. I've not found any current examples of this, but one of my recommendations in the study is that this would be a very powerful combination. So now let me share some examples. And I'd like to start with a school hub Sacramento Elementary School in the Park Rose District in Oregon. Sacramento's student body is over 95% free and reduced lunch and 55% students of color. It is one of 90 community schools that are part of a county system of community schools in Multnomah County. Each blue tack on this map represents a community school. This system is called Schools Uniting Neighborhoods, or SUN, and it's a collaboration between the county and the 6 districts that make up the county. Each one of these community schools has a site manager who's responsible for running an after-school program and connecting children and families to the comprehensive services they need. Now SUN has a new initiative taking place in 9 elementary schools. It's called the P3 pilot, and Brooke Chilton-Timmons, who's on our panel, is one of the leaders of the pilot. And as I talk about these examples, I'm going to use the terminology that the communities use in referring to their work, but all of the examples meet the definition of a First 10 initiative. SUN's P3 pilot leverages this existing system, the site manager and the system of comprehensive supports, and it extends it to children ages 0 to 4 and their families. The funding for this P3 pilot ultimately comes from a $9 million state program allocated by the state legislature to support P3 work. Each of these 9 pilot schools has a P3 coordinator to work with the community school site manager. At Sacramento Elementary School, the P3 coordinator's name is Manny. And in her first year, Manny began by conducting outreach to all the families in the school's catchment area. She visited with the cultural groups. She visited with the church groups. She met families. She began to gain their trust and then started holding play and learn groups in the school weekly. Parents bring their young children to play and learn groups, and together they read, they sing, they play, and the parents also learn about child development and school readiness. Through the play and learn groups and a variety of other family engagement activities, the P3 coordinators build relationships with families. In Manny's case, she took them on field trips to museums, to the library, and the like, and then she began to connect families to health and social services, depending on their needs. Then in year 2, Manny and the other P3 coordinators began to connect with licensed family child care providers in the neighborhood, as well as informal family friend and neighbor caregivers, and include these caregivers in the play and learn groups as well. Manny builds relationships with these providers and connects them to a variety of training supports. So that's our first example. That's one example of a First 10 school hub. A second example comes from Metro Omaha, Nebraska, where a birth to 3rd grade pilot is taking place in 10 schools across a number of districts in the metropolitan area. Chris Lopez-Anderson is the program manager of this initiative, and this pilot is part of a larger plan called the Superintendents Plan, referring to the superintendents of the participating districts. And the overall plan is funded by a half-cent levy. The Buffett Early Childhood Institute is contracted to provide technical assistance around this plan. That is, they receive money. So it's important to emphasize that the county is paying for this work and not the Buffett Early Childhood Institute. The pilot in Metro Omaha is the brainchild of Sam Mizels, the well-known early childhood expert, and this is how he explains the rationale that underpins the pilot. Our basic belief, drawn from the research of the past half-century, is that persistent efforts in the early years will result in persistence of long-term effects for children. Each of these pilot schools is supported by a home visitor who conducts home visits for children ages 0 to 3 and their families, a family facilitator who supports families with children ages 3 to 8, and an educational facilitator who acts as an instructional coach and supports quality and alignment in the early grades at the elementary school. Further, the home visitor and the family facilitator team up, and together they run parent-child interaction groups similar to Multnomah County's Play and Learn groups. So in Omaha, you have monthly rather than weekly parent-child interaction sessions, but then you also have a home visitor with a caseload of 15 infants and toddlers. And you have a half-time coach working on instructional alignment. And I should add here that what the educational facilitator does, one of the things that the educational facilitator does, is provide feedback on each teacher's class results, a widely used and widely respected classroom quality tool. This initiative is being formally evaluated, and the results have been very promising so far. And they include rising classroom quality scores using the class tool. So one thing I would like to highlight about the pilot in Metro Omaha is the extent to which in many of the schools this work has become part of the school's identity. I know that this varies across the 10 schools, but I visited 5 of them, and I was really struck by the level of buy-in on the part of the principals. Here's a slide from Sandos Elementary School. The principal introduces herself as a principal of a birth through 5th grade school, as do many of the principals in the pilot. And at Sandos, the teachers and the students in the school have internalized the idea that the school supports young children. Students will even find the home visitor and tell her when their moms are pregnant. It doesn't always turn out to be the case, but it shows the extent to which children have understood the broader mission of the school. One of the things I emphasize in the study is the important role of school districts in improving curriculum and instruction in the early grades, and that's the case in both Multnomah County and in Metro Omaha. And I also describe district initiatives to improve teaching and learning in Normal, Illinois, in Boston, and in San Francisco. So we've seen 2 First Hub school examples. Both of these communities are developing relationships with families with young children ages 0 to 4. And importantly, both bring early childhood professionals into schools to engage families in developmentally appropriate activities. And through this, they're building early childhood expertise. Multnomah counties, including family child care in this work, and in the study, I also describe first 10 school hubs that are working with early childhood centers as well. The first 10 school hubs that I studied suggest a number of design considerations for communities interested in doing this work. For example, should the focus be on play and learn groups? Does it include home visiting? Do you provide direct support to families? Do you include early childhood centers? And so on. And as you would expect, there are challenges in doing this work. I won't go into detail here, but it's important for communities to be aware of the challenges they're likely to face, and our panelists will have an opportunity to address some of those challenges. Now, I'd like to share an example of a First 10 community partnership. This is the work that Leanne Ellis leads in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Cambridge is now in the 3rd year of implementing a birth through 3rd grade plan. This is a joint initiative of the school department and the city, funded by the city. Cambridge's budget for this work was $1.3 million in year 1, $2.3 million in year 2, and $3.3 million this year. Cambridge's plan is designed around 5 goals: access, quality, family engagement and partnership, health, and governance. The partnership is overseen by a steering committee and includes 3 subcommittees: access and quality, family engagement and partnership, and health. Working with these subcommittees, Leanne and her staff have implemented an impressive set of initiatives, all of which follow from the original plan. And so that I don't overwhelm you, I'm only showing you 1/2 of the initiatives that Cambridge has implemented. What's important is the comprehensiveness of Cambridge's strategy. I'll draw your attention to a few of these initiatives. For example, a team from Tufts University assessed the state of home visiting programs throughout the city, and now a work group is designing a home visiting system that will support all of these home visiting programs. The partnership is running 2 quality pilots, one for centers and one for family child care providers. The one for centers includes mentoring for directors, coaching for teachers, professional development, and communities of practice, and it has already seen very strong results in terms of classroom quality measures in 9 preschools. The partnership is developing a citywide transition to kindergarten plan, and kindergarten teachers are piloting Boston's renowned kindergarten curriculum. What I do in this study is compare Cambridge's work to another community partnership that focused much effort on the early years. And this is a historical example in Montgomery County, Maryland in the 2000s that was heavily studied. And you can see the common elements here. The work in both communities is driven by a clear equity agenda. These are communities with large tax bases that are investing funds to support low-income families. Both communities use ambitious strategic plans that address the full First 10 continuum to guide their work, and both have created new organizing structures. And again, this work is not challenge-free, and it's important that communities are aware of the challenges they're likely to face. I'll conclude with 3 takeaways and a preview of a framework that I describe in more detail in the study. First, we're seeing the outlines of an emerging model of okay, a couple of slides are missing. 3 takeaways. First, we're seeing the outlines of an emerging model of a First 10 elementary school that, with district support, collaborates with early childhood professionals to improve teaching, learning, and care in developmentally appropriate ways across the first decade of children's lives. Second, First 10 community partnerships suggest a roadmap for towns, cities, large neighborhoods within a city, and counties to develop comprehensive approaches to improving programs and services for young children and their family. And third, this work taking place around the country suggests a new innovation, a community partnership like in Cambridge, but that also supports hubs like in Multnomah County and in Metro Omaha. This combination would be a very powerful and systemic First 10 approach. Finally, the initiatives I described suggest a framework for understanding the role of First 10 school hubs and community partnerships. This work begins with a commitment to equity, a commitment that all children will learn and thrive. We do that by supporting effective schools, nurturing families and strong communities, and by supporting collaboration across families, schools, and communities. Schools support families, families strengthen communities, and communities support schools in an ongoing process. What we're seeing in leading-edge communities is that First 10 school hubs and community partnerships support this circle of collaboration through 4 roles: supporting professional collaboration to improve teaching and learning, coordinating comprehensive services, promoting culturally responsive partnerships with families, and providing strategic leadership and ongoing assessment. You can find the study at first10.org. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this presentation. My name is Christina Samuels, and I'm an associate editor at Education Week, where I cover early childhood education. Education Week is the nation's leading authority on K-12 education, and I'm very excited to be here. Thank you so much to David and to New America for inviting me to participate. So I cover early childhood, and I think obviously there's universal agreement on the importance of the early years. But what does this mean? One of the things that I found most valuable when I was reading this report is seeing the fact that it was offering concrete examples of how communities are really putting their support for children, or what they say will be their support for children, into action. So joining me for this part of the discussion is Deborah Stipek, a professor of education at Stanford University, is specializing in many areas, including policy and early childhood education, and also Kwesi Rollins, the Vice President for Leadership and Engagement for the Institute for Educational Leadership, and they'll both be sharing their impressions of this work. And Kwesi, I'll start with you. Your work has involved developing systems like this to support educational reforms in community schools. And so what do you think about, what are the implications that you see in the work that David has shared in his report that's going on in these many communities?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Very important development. I think the findings obviously make a lot of sense. Anything that calls for people to work more closely together to achieve the kind of outcomes that we need to achieve is a good idea. I think it's worth noting that very often there's some concern among early childhood practitioners that we're not doing developmentally appropriate things for young children. And I think the same thing is true for communities. There is such a thing as what's developmentally appropriate. And so a community can't just have no history of working together, no partnership, no kind of collaborative culture, and then just all of a sudden wake up one day and do all of this. And Multnomah County is a perfect example, as you saw that map that David showed, where they have 90 community schools now, and I didn't know that new number, so that's a great number. We started working with Multnomah County. IEL, by the way, is the home for the Coalition for Community Schools. And so we've had that idea for over 20 years, and we have worked with a number of partners. And Multnomah County was one of the places that decided to engage with the community school strategy, primarily as an anti-poverty strategy. And they started with probably 7 or 8 schools back in 1998. So to see them all these years later with 90 schools that are part of the Sun service system, and that is a county that covers, there's 7 school districts, the largest being Portland, Oregon, and 6 of the 7 districts are part of the Sun service system. So it gives you a sense of context. So they've been at the whole idea of working closely together and facilitating the collaboration of partners for quite some time, and have some expertise in that. In around 2008, 2009, we, with some funding from the Kellogg Foundation, decided that it was a good idea, based on our own learning of the importance of school readiness and early childhood education, and et cetera, to really get community schools places, which up to that point had been strictly focused on K-12, to be more intentional about connecting to their early childhood community. And Multnomah County was one of the places where we piloted that work. We also piloted it in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so these were 3 places that already had a tradition of working together, had relatively stable, if you will, early childhood communities. So they had some strong early childhood work and tradition and history, but they hadn't necessarily been working together. And so our role was very simply to bring them together, to facilitate that partnership, to expose them to some national experts and researchers, to expose them to best practice. Our understanding in those days, we used the language of 0 to 8. And so first 10 is something that we'll learn to talk about first. The first decade is actually simpler than making the case, but just some best practices in early education and in alignment and transition. And all these years later, I mean, Brooke's position didn't exist when we started that work in 2008, 2009 for Multnomah County. They piloted a whole different kind of a program, which they called Kindergarten Camp, I think it was. With the little bit of seed money that they had, they hired a half-time person, and they had such success with that pilot in 3 or 4 elementary schools, which is simply about deeply engaging their community around the importance of early childhood and creating some partnerships, that they expanded the program. The county created a position, and now Brooke is in that position. And so it's a classic story of what can happen if you continue to grow your strategy. And as you think about 90 schools now, not all of them are elementary schools, obviously, but a number of them are elementary schools. And so these kinds of first 10 partnerships are not only feasible, they're probably one of the only ways we can really make this happen, because schools can't really do this all by themselves. You really need deep partnership.
Sure. No, I think that the power of those partnerships really comes through in this work. One of the things that's interesting is that when you talk about the focus in schools, and Deborah, I'm hoping that you can speak to this. One thing that I've certainly written about is concerns that although schools are important partners in this work, there's concerns that are we pushing something down to the young children that is looking like schools, except for 4-year-olds, kindergarten except for 3-year-olds, et cetera. I wonder whether any of this work raises any concerns or cautions for you as you look at what some of the schools are doing.
Yes, I remember. I'm old enough to remember this debate when there was some talk about putting Head Start in the Department of Education instead of HHS. And the people in the early childhood field were adamantly against that, because they were afraid that if Head Start was in the Department of Education, children would be doing flashcards and ditto sheets, and all of the accountability issues and things like that would be pushed down into early childhood. We've come a long way since that debate, and I think now we recognize that young children can learn and can achieve at a much higher level than I think we really understood in the old days, not by worksheets and but by playful learning, but guided, planned, goal-directed learning opportunities that teachers can provide. One of the districts that we work with that has tried to create greater alignment between pre-K and the early elementary grades, the principals started visiting the pre-K programs because they became responsible for the pre-K programs. What they were seeing in pre-K they were realizing were actually valuable in their early elementary grades as well. More play, more focus on developing self-regulation skills and social emotional skills and that sort of thing. And so if it's done effectively, it's not pushing pre-K first grade down in, or first grade kindergarten down into pre-K. It's creating more synergy and more continuity that is developmentally appropriate for all of those levels.
Yeah, I know that when I have had a chance to visit schools and visit kindergartens, I remember visiting a kindergarten where the teachers had to fight to bring, play and the dress-up area and the sand table and the water table back into the kindergarten classroom. That was a story. It was enough of a story to send me to a school district to cover it. So, so it's definitely, I feel some tension happening there.
But that can be a problem too, because there are people who talk about play-based instruction or play-based curriculum. Or if you just Google preschool in your community, you'll see 100 play-based preschool programs. Just having sand and water and a dress-up corner doesn't mean kids are learning everything that we need them to know. And so I also worry about it going too far the other way, where basically free play becomes this mystical, wonderful, extraordinary thing that children should be doing all day. They should have time. Young children need time, just like 69-year-olds need time to play. But they also need some opportunity to develop some of the skills we know are going to be important for them in school and in life. And that requires guided, purposeful instruction, but playful.
Absolutely. David, did you have a thought on that?
Yes, I just wanted to piggyback on what Deborah is saying. There are a couple of great examples that I found in my research of exactly the dynamic that Deborah is describing, this push-up, a combination of push-up and push-down. And one of them is in Normal, Illinois, where the pre-kindergarten teachers and the kindergarten teachers began to collaborate with each other. And out of that collaboration, the pre-K teachers decided that they needed to work more on concept development and to extend their units into longer investigative themes. But also out of that collaboration, the kindergarten teachers decided that they would implement a period a day that was structured, guided play. And this was a result of them having observed each other's classes and kind of gone through a reciprocal process. So I think that alignment worked very nicely there in a very kind of face-to-face way. I would also just quickly say that our classic example of push-up in the United States right now is in Boston, Massachusetts, where they began with the pre-K curriculum and professional development model, had high success with that. A Harvard study showed that we have the highest gains in preschool at scale that we've seen in the country. They then built on that and developed a kindergarten curriculum, a first grade curriculum, and a second grade curriculum. So you see the push-up, where the early childhood department is pushing early childhood up, but also in the community-based preschools where they're implementing that pre-K program, we're seeing a much greater emphasis on kind of observing children and their development and progress over the year, and that's being pushed down. So it's a nice example.
One of the really good things about the alignment between pre-K and those early elementary grades is that we don't talk about the pre-K curriculum, the K curriculum, the first grade curriculum as much. Because, excuse me, any first grade teacher is going to have kids whose mastery levels are closer to what the pre-K curriculum is designed to address. And they may have some kids who are actually at the second or third grade level. And by getting together and looking at the continuum of development, they're more likely to think about what do these children need as opposed to what is the first grade curriculum that I feel compelled to teach.
Yeah, I think that there's some really important implications here for professional development that hopefully we'll get to explore a little bit in the second panel when we talk with the folks who are overseeing some of the specific panels, specific programs. David, I was wondering if you could explain a little bit. One thing that I thought was different is that you distinguish between First 10 schools and First 10 communities. Obviously, there are some elements that overlap here, but there were some differences that were different enough that you felt that it was important to pull these things apart. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what some of the differences are there, maybe how they complement each other, maybe, some individual challenges that these two forms take.
Sure. So as I went around the country and observed this work, it became very clear to me that in some instances, this first 10 work was very much taking place around a single elementary school. And that elementary school, in these two cases, Multnomah County and in Metro Omaha, the focus there is on reaching out directly to families with young children before they've entered school, which is, when you think about it, is really novel. We haven't had elementary schools reaching out into their neighborhoods and bringing children into their schools in play and learn groups very, very much, and supporting them with home visiting. And in some places, that's what this work is. That's the only way they think about it. In other places, like in Cambridge, you can do this work across a broader geographic area. And so that it's not about one school, it's about all the schools in a district, or all the schools in a large neighborhood within a district. And then you're really talking more about system building. So it's, how do we improve all the home visiting programs that are serving those children? How do we improve the quality of all the community-based preschools in that zone? The quality of all the family child care providers? Rather than creating an individual transition plan between one community-based preschool and one elementary school, can we create a transition plan that will encompass all of the community-based preschools and Head Starts? Can that be a general template for all of those feeders into all of the elementary schools within a zone? And so, yes, I think the argument is ultimately we need both. In many communities, we need both. We need to be working at that system level on quality improvement and alignment, but then developing those special individual relationships between elementary schools and families that are going to be coming to that school.
If I could, I think I just want to reiterate, you're absolutely right. It's a both-and approach, because it's important to paint a picture of what it looks like in an individual school, but it's also important to promote what it could look like across an entire system. Every school community is slightly different, even within the same town, and so the contexts are all different for sure. But we do need to have a group that's kind of paying attention to the entire system, particularly when you have a lot of children and families who have been historically underserved, who don't have access to as many resources, and et cetera. Then it's incumbent upon a lot of the other kind of leaders within the system to really have a clearer understanding of how they can facilitate the kinds of services and supports that are needed to make it happen.
Crazy, I think your experience in doing this work, brings up a question that I had, which is how these initiatives interact with other initiatives. There's other initiatives that have some piece of this. I think we talked about the campaign for grade level reading, or there's other different sorts of programs that exist to support early childhood. And there's a lot of players here. Part of it is, that I'm thinking is, how do you organize it in a way so that everybody's kind of moving in the right direction and maybe not overlapping efforts or repeating efforts, or, even working at cross purposes. How do you see that piece working with something like that?
It's an interesting time because, there are a lot of different efforts. There are a lot of different kind of branded approaches and et cetera that are out there in the world in which we live. But at the same time, there's a lot of synergy across all of these various efforts to really work together. And so if you're savvy, like a lot of community schools places also became part of the campaign for grade level reading, and we have Yoli here representing the campaign, because it was the kind of public call to action that was going to be useful for them to move a bigger strategy, if that makes sense. And so there are times when, kind of all of the notoriety around certain issues, we're in that moment in terms of chronic absenteeism, where it gets everybody's attention and hopefully can move us in the right direction. Sometimes it backfires where places, because, for example, they've heard that there's all of this important action that needs to happen in order to get kids to read on grade level by the third grade, and instead of working together to make that happen, they'll do kind of punitive measures. So that's always kind of a danger. But I think it's a good moment. I mean, I'm encouraged by the idea that there are a lot of folks working across the board, I know nationally, that are really trying to get on the same page, even if they have kind of specific campaigns or specific projects. There are a lot, so it's a unique moment. Some of that is also driven by funders that are working more together and across their funding stuff collaboratively to achieve a set of kind of outcomes that make it. So Heising Simons is a classic example because they fund a lot of particular activities around this, but then they're also working with other funders in community to have a greater impact in place, which is important.
Yeah. You know, that actually is a good transition for another thing that I was thinking about, which is obviously the feasibility of all of this. And Deborah, I'd love you to start with this. I mean, schools are still, having to meet academic goals and, work with students of all grades and work with students who are coming in with all sorts of different needs. And, is there, enough capacity in schools or, in communities for this kind of work to take off? Could this be more widespread? Do we need some special ingredients to make it work?
I think if you don't think it's feasible, then you really need to read David's report, because I think it demonstrates very clearly that it is feasible. And these are not communities that are particularly known for it being progressive or doing extraordinary things. They're regular communities. So yes, it's feasible. I think one of the problems, though, is that it often depends a lot on soft money, funders that come in. So it's feasible to get it going. Sustaining it is, I think, one of the biggest challenges. It often requires someone who's dynamic, strong, highly valued and respected in the community, who can play a leadership role, get people around the same table, get people to listen to each other, and to actually coordinate rather than compete with each other. And if that person goes away, I've seen these things kind of fall apart. So it's definitely feasible to start, but I really recommend that anybody that wants to launch something like this, that they think long and hard at the very beginning about how it's going to be sustained, how it's going to be made, being built into the system. One of the things I really liked in the examples in David's report were several places where it had started out with soft money, but had then the schools had seen, or the organizations had seen the value of it and had put it into their base budget. So these are opportunities for us to demonstrate to administrators and policymakers just how valuable some of these coordinated efforts are. But it does need to be sustained, and that's another set of issues in addition to just getting it off the ground.
Well, it's a leadership issue because, part of it requires consistent leadership with a certain kind of collaborative value. When we started out the pilot, we went to places that already had a culture of collaboration across a number of agencies first, because that we knew that was the best chance. And in the case of Multnomah, Tulsa, and Albuquerque, and some of the other places where we went, that work is still alive because people were already working together. They saw that this approach had value, and then they committed to keeping it going. And the collaboration wasn't necessarily dependent on outside dollars. And so that's the key. But it ends up being a leadership issue. We all know that everybody loves the idea of collaborating, but the challenge in sustaining deep collaboration is because we don't really like to work together. So that is like the paradox in all of this. And so there are times when communities have collaborative culture, the right leaders in place, the right stuff, the stars are aligned, and then they can really kind of move forward. And then there are times, not so much.
We often undermine that sustained leadership. For example, if you look at superintendents, what is the average length that a superintendent serves is about 2.5 years, I think. Still, yeah. And the places where really good work has been done, it's very common that it's been a long-term superintendent that's been able to keep it going. So, and principals get moved around, and so we're not necessarily organizing our schools in ways to sustain these kinds of efforts.
David, yeah, I was wondering what secret sauce you saw when you were visiting your communities.
Well, one of the things I wanted to draw our attention to, if we're going to talk about sustaining this work, is the important role of states. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that Multnomah County is in the state of Oregon. That is to say, Oregon is, I think, the only state that has allocated in the state budget $9 million to support collaboration between elementary schools and early childhood. And so, and it's that state funding that's paying for the P3 pilot that I described in Multnomah County. So that's one really powerful example of, I think, the role of state. And so there is a P3 coordinator, specialist at the state level who supports this work. The communities have an opportunity to learn from each other. So those are other roles that states can play. And then I wanted to highlight another example that is much newer than these others, but is still, I think, very promising. And so in the state of Maine, a state that has many rural communities and not a large state budget for education, but they have 13, the state of Maine is supporting 13 communities across the state in doing this alignment work between early childhood and elementary school. All of these communities have developed plans. And at the same time, the state has formed an interagency state-level team, a P3 team at the state level that specifically is engaged in supporting these 13 communities. How can our policies support these 13 communities? How can our experts at the state level support these 13 communities? And I think that two-level approach, working at the state and working at the community level, could be very powerful for addressing this key issue that I think you've all raised, which is how do we sustain this work over time?
I'm glad you gave examples of the way states can and have actually supported this work. Maybe this is because I come from California, but all I can think of is examples of all the state policies that make this really more difficult. So, for example, the funding is very fragmented. Even things like preschool versus childcare come from different sectors, different accountability, different resources, different regulations, and so on. Yet these are the same kids, and parents need care all day long, not just for 2.5 hours. The preparation of pre-K teachers is completely different from the preparation of elementary school teachers. And so when people try to do PD, combining them, it's very difficult because they have very different foundations on which to base the professional development opportunities. So I hope that California looks at some of the examples that you just gave, because there are ways that states can facilitate this kind of continuity and alignment that are not being done across the country.
You know, let me end just this part of our discussion with a thought or a question, and anybody can address this. Do we have a way yet to measure the success of these programs? You know, test scores are such a, difficult way to look at things. You know, obviously there's more to life than just test scores. But how can a community look at what it is doing and tell whether what it's doing is working, by whatever metric working might mean?
Well, I can tell you for our pilot, I mean, we didn't do a gold standard research project, but we did look at a couple of things. We had a formal evaluation, and we found that kids were more ready for school, families were more engaged in school, the staff was better prepared to manage all of that. And then obviously there are all these studies around Head Start as a specific intervention, and often the conversation with Head Start, especially for the skeptics, is that the gains don't last. And so part of what's important about your question is we do have to figure out a way to talk about this in such a way that the fact that we don't have test scores to point to moving up doesn't mean that we don't have kind of rigorous evaluation. But we also have to say, well, if the effects of Head Start aren't lasting, it's because the handoff to schools is poor because of the lack of strong first 10 partnerships. I mean, that's literally how you have to talk about it. It's not because what we did in Head Start was a waste of time. It's because when they get to elementary school, it's like, oh, it's a whole other set of issues, a whole different kind of engagement of families, et cetera. So we have to, I don't know that we have a clean answer to that question. You know, we were very pleased with the results for our pilot because it moved the needle in the right direction, which is fundamentally what systems and communities want to do. But we also, as a field, or mixed fields, have to figure out a cleaner way to talk about all of this.
Yeah, I think one of the problems is what it is, what you are measuring.
Yeah.
Because by design, these are multifaceted programs.
Yeah.
And they're different. So I think if you went to those 90 schools, my guess is you would find 90 slightly different variations of the same model because the schools are in different communities with different needs, different resources, and so on. And so one of the problems is people want to know what made the difference. We did 7 things in my community. We added home visiting, we added full day kindergarten, and so on. So what's making a difference? But it's the collection that is really making the difference. It's the added value, it's the multiplicative value. The sum is greater than, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts because they're reinforcing each other. So you can look broadly in communities at whether kids' kindergarten readiness seems to be improving, and the markers like that. Attendance is a marker. You look for markers that suggest that we know are basically milestones on the way to improvement. But I don't think we're going to be able to randomly assign whole communities to 3 different versions of this design. It just won't work. We can look at the components. What I've seen is in all of the examples that I know and that I read in David's report, they're building on a lot of research on the components. We know that home visiting can work. We know that high-quality preschool has benefits, and sometimes long-term benefits if it's followed up by high-quality elementary school. So if you look at the components, you know that there is an evidence base for them. So what we're doing is just putting these components that have evidence for them and expecting a multiplicative effect because they're reinforcing each other.
Yeah, I think that, having all these pieces kind of coming together, and I think you almost think that there has to be some kind of value in just kind of breaking down the silos that exist, that can sometimes exist between, entities that are supposed to be doing some of the same things, but, but for whatever reason, because of funding streams or because one is in a Department of Health and Human Services versus a Department of Education, that they've never quite come together. There's got to be some value just in that alone. This is fantastic. We actually have a second panel that'll be coming up that'll be talking about some of the work on the ground. So if we'll just take a minute and switch panels for a moment.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Panel 2. So this is great. So here we'll have some leaders who are in communities around the country that are doing the work that David outlines in this report. We have Brooke Chilton-Timmons is the Early Learning Coordinator for Multnomah County. Chris Lopez-Anderson is the Program Administrator for the Buffett Early Childhood Institute, and Leanne Ellis is Early Childhood Director for the City of Cambridge. And, when you read this report, you'll understand some of the individual questions here. Each one of these entities does similar work, but they also have, sort of differing focuses on how they do this in their communities based on their individual context. And Brooke, one of the things that came up is that these play and learn groups, which is a term that I actually had not really heard before, so I'd love if you explain that briefly, is a really important part of the work that you're doing in Multnomah County. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that has meant to have families coming into elementary schools, you know, how this sort of serves a good community outreach purpose.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. We're really excited about Play and Learn groups because we know a lot of children in our community don't have access to high-quality early learning experiences, whether that's a supported birth to 5 service or high-quality preschool. And so this is an opportunity where families come into schools and get to learn along with their kids and get to build community with each other. And in those Play and Learn groups, we're building relationships with the P3 coordinator. So like David mentioned, in our model, we have a full-time P3 coordinator in each of these 9 schools. And we're building off of those community school supports that are in each of those buildings. What's exciting about Play and Learn is that it honors families as their child's first teacher. We know that they're experts in their lives, in their children, in their communities, and we want to bring their expertise into the room with us and learn with them. And we use an exciting model out of Seattle from Child Care Resources. It's called the Kaleidoscope model. And it also provides space for parents to bring in their expertise to that room and to that space. And it actually has pathways for parents to become leaders within those groups. So it's not a P3 coordinator's expert telling families this is what you need to know. It's really coming together. And the exciting part about that model is also that the learning doesn't stop when a family leaves that room. These are activities that are designed to be replicable in families' homes. They use materials very purposefully that families are going to have in their homes. This is not a bunch of fancy things that coordinators are buying for families to use. This is really about, here's how we can use this toilet paper roll in 20 different ways. And here is what your child is learning when we do this. So really hands-on learning, families getting to talk to each other, building those supportive networks. And that relationship with the P3 coordinator is really important. David described a Sacramento elementary school where we know that 95% of those children are eligible for free and reduced lunch, where their family's access to basic needs can be limited. And so it's connecting them to services earlier that they may not have known about. So if a family's coming in for a Play and Learn group, they may not realize that that school also has a food pantry on site that's designed to be welcoming, that's designed to have easy shopping with fresh food right there. So having that connection with that P3 coordinator who they're building that relationship with is really essential. It also means that they may have a referral to early intervention if the P3 coordinator notices that there may be a developmental concern for that child. And because they're not in other formal settings, that early intervention support may not have occurred otherwise. We're also, I think another exciting piece of this work is around Play and Learn groups, is it's a chance for principals and other school staff to start that shift of that baby across the street, they're going to be our students someday. You know, what is that? It's a big shift for principals who we've talked about already and school staff who already have a lot on their plate to start thinking, that family, what could we do? How do we think about them differently? How do we invite them earlier into our building and connect with them? And particularly, how do we do that for families of color and families who speak languages other than English? That's a big piece of our work is, how do we change the kind of environment, the kind of welcome that every family receives when they walk in that building? We want all families to feel like this is their school, and we want them here, we want to learn about them, we want to partner with them in more authentic ways than typically happens in a school building where you get the flyer about literacy night and tells you what time to come and what you need to know about literacy and then sends you on your way. So we want to flip that on its head and really push schools to think about how we can engage them more authentically and get to know them and their kids early.
Sure. You know, I'm curious with the Play and Learn groups, what age do you first start interacting with families, or what age of a child?
It's really meant to be a birth to 5,
Sure.
Which, as you can imagine, makes P3 coordinators' jobs really complicated at times. But the Kaleidoscope model is meant to provide those types of settings, give ideas for how someone who's leading a group like that can set up different areas of the room to really meet the needs of that little baby who's on the floor and needs a safe place to be, and that 4-year-old who's got lots of energy. And we also want to provide engaging activities for them as well.
Sure. So Chris, one of the things we were talking about obviously in the earlier panel was about professional development and about developmentally appropriate education. I know that part of your program is bringing educational facilitators into schools in addition to the family facilitators. So this is somebody, as I'm understanding, who is working with the staff at the school on creating appropriate, kind of being welcoming for young children. I'd love to hear more about how that really works.
Great, well, thank you. In addition to the home visitors that we have and the family facilitators, we have educational facilitators. In essence, it's a learning coach. And we really value that part, that added benefit that we can give to a school. We know that embedded job coaching has high potential to change teacher practices. So what the educational facilitators do, each one of them has 10 schools, and it might be 2 schools within the same district, or 2 schools each representing a different district. So then they have to really scan their environment. We're in our 4th year, and I think the first year was really spent in building a strong relationship. Coaching a teacher or mentoring a teacher, coaching a principal, that can be a scary experience for a teacher who hasn't had that opportunity to engage in that kind of personal reflection. So we know that one of the things that really changes practices is that self-reflection. So building that relationship, starting to scan the school district, scan the building as to what might be their needs, what are their strengths, how can we build on their strengths to address some of their needs. So we use the class as a classroom measure to start some conversations with teachers. What I have found is that sometimes the real obvious school data isn't really being used. So really working with the instructional coaches, they're my personal team. I've got a talented group of women at this time. Really working with them how to look at data and then bring that data back in a very meaningful, non-confrontational, strength-based approach. And really having those instructional conversations. So the instructional facilitator will do building-wide PD, professional learning, but we know that professional learning in and of itself is not going to really move the needle much in teaching practices. So then how can they move that professional development into a grade level team where they start having some shared conversation, or a vertical team where they can start looking at the practices from the pre-K to the K to the first, and then looking at how can I have coaching conversations, how can I have a teacher invite me into their room to do an observation, to start building off of some goals, maybe a teacher practice goal or a student data goal, and then really looking at that data to move the practices along. And we know that when you have professional development accompanied with the modeling and the practice with the coaching, that's when we have the best opportunity to really move instructional practices. I think one thing that makes it exciting and sometimes difficult is that coaching, instructional facilitation, really needs to come from a leadership. You need a school leader, and I think that the panel before us really spoke quite well about the importance of a school leader. And some of those school leaders are also teacher leaders that really embrace this concept and culture and climate of coaching, of wanting to be lifelong learners, and how we really push ourselves to have those reflective conversations, which sometimes we're not in our teacher preparation programs. That's not something that is always really given an opportunity for us to come in and really look on how to be a reflective practitioner. So it's an exciting relationship to have. They have become part of those schools and those school communities. But I also want them to kind of be able to step back and have that objective lens so that they can bring that, have we thought about this? When you did this, tell me a little bit more why, so that we can be that added value to spark the learning.
Sure. I wonder what kind of feedback that that the teachers at the schools have given back to you or to the instructional facilitators, if there's particular things that they're looking for more of, that they are very appreciative to hear somebody outside the building talking with them about.
We have great stories, and I think that when David was talking about the research and how to research this, I think one of the things that is important for us to capture in our school as a hub story is those stories, those personal narratives of what's changed, because sometimes that's not found in a test score. It's really taking that perspective. So we have lots of different stories of where a teacher had never thought of this and how it's really changed her mind. So I'm having stories and I'm seeing pictures of my ed facilitators back in Omaha, and where they've shared with me the impact that they're having with their teachers. The one thing that we do differently in our model is that I then coach. I have reflective supervision monthly with my team members individually to give them that opportunity to be thinking also about their practices as they're interacting with the teachers that they're coaching with. And then once a month, I try meeting individually with principals to have that opportunity to be a thinking partner with them. And sometimes they don't like it when I show up and I'm wanting to talk about something that they'd rather not show up about. But I really believe as an educator that that's just an important aspect that sometimes we forget to do.
Well, we're going to come back to that thought, but about principals and kind of navigating some of the different personalities here. But Leanne, I had wanted to ask about Cambridge's work, particularly the governance structure that you use. So this is a little bit different from the other programs that have been discussed thus far. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, as David was showing his slide of a partnership, I was going, yes, check, check, check. We got all of those people at the table. And so we have a steering committee that provides strategic input on our plan. And it is comprised of, I feel like I'm very loud, sorry, comprised of government officials. We have the assistant city manager, then we have somebody from human services from the city. We have school department personnel. We have the assistant superintendent for elementary ed and a principal. And then we have people from the library, as well as the housing development, as well as mental health service providers, as well as experts in the field of family child care, and an executive director who runs a small system of 6 preschools connected to a university. So the table of the people who sit on the steering committee really are representative of the whole community. And so that is the group that provides strategic input 3 times a year on where we are. Then under that, as David showed, we have 3 subcommittees, and these subcommittees are related to our goals. So we smooshed access and quality together in one committee, because how do you divide those 2? You can't. And we have a family engagement and partnership subcommittee, and we have a health subcommittee. And they're made up of, they meet monthly, there are 14 to 17 people on each committee, and they really represent the community at large. Again, it's the mirror image kind of the steering committee. On the health subcommittee, for example, we have somebody from the public health department. We have a chief pediatrician for the local hospital. We have a preschool director. We have a mental health agency and providers. We have people who from WIC, people who provide services, home visiting services. So we have a wide array of people sitting at the table, and they each bring a really unique perspective to the discussion at hand. So the person from WIC and the person from preschool might see something from 2 different angles or perspectives, and it gets hashed out in the subcommittee. The subcommittee is co-chaired by 2 people who are members of the subcommittee but act as co-chairs. And I meet with them once a month before the next meeting to plan the meeting. And the charge of the subcommittees are really to shape the implementation of our ambitious plan. How are we going to do the things that the plan says we must do? And I would say, I'm just looking at my notes so I don't forget anything. I would say that the subcommittees are really driving the work, whether it be kindergarten transitions or home visiting. What's come really from the subcommittees that are really fabulous is just recently we were talking about health and nutrition of young children because of the obesity crisis that we see now in young children. And together with some of the people at the table, we applied for a Catalyst grant to study what is the policy in early childhood that contributes to or does not contribute to, who helps healthy eating and active living. And so these subcommittees not only shape, but they go off and they do added things because that partnership and the discussion at the table make them think, oh, listen, I saw this grant opportunity. We could find out what are the policies in early childhood centers and family child care and figure out what's the next step from there. So I think they are generative not only of shaping, but of creating and going a little bit further. I think the other thing I would say is that these are really important practices that we have used. I think they're intentional because the community has to be at the table to develop that partnership for sustainability and long-term buy-in, because we don't want these initiatives to become and fade away. Kwesi talked a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, I think that piece, I was wondering a little bit about how one wrangles like all of these multiple personalities, but it sounds like there's an opportunity there for folks to pursue, within the subcommittee structure, something that they consider to be important to them. So nobody's priority is being sort of quashed. People are getting an opportunity to explore what they want to bring back to the partnership.
Yeah, I think that also an example would be not only squashed, nothing is squashed, but people really shape the work. Again, I come to the health subcommittee, not that the other subcommittees are not great, but we were talking about one of our charges is to expand mental health awareness. And as you know, in some communities, the discussion of mental health is a taboo. And so the discussion about, well, my parents don't like to hear that from a family support worker, or the McKinney-Vento liaison saying, oh, that's just not cool, brought us to the term of looking at wellness, the concept of wellness and so I think, again, I really think these subcommittees enrich the work we do.
Sure. Brooke, I wanted to go back and ask a little bit about the work that you do in Multnomah County and the very diverse population that I'm sure that you work with. And obviously you all are taking, particular efforts, as the programs are in the entire report, in reaching out to a diverse community. I'm wondering how that works on the ground in your community. What kind of work do you do there?
Yeah, so just for some context, Multnomah County is rapidly changing, like I'm sure many communities across the country, and a lot of people are being pushed out from Portland out to further out east. There's one small school district that has gone from 16% students of color to 54% students of color in only 10 years. And that's a couple years old, that statistic. I'm curious, I think it's probably even higher now. So those schools aren't necessarily ready and full of knowledge about how to fully welcome more diverse students and families. And so one of the exciting things about the Sun service system is that we can come alongside schools and with our community-based organizations to really help them think differently about supporting families. So in that community school model, we have an opportunity to provide more holistic supports past the classroom, to whether it's to meet basic needs, just to provide family engagement opportunities that respond to strengths and desires of the community as opposed to the school. But as a county, we also wanted to address the disparities that we were seeing in the outcomes in our community, and we have a strong commitment to racial equity. And so part of the way that we're trying to shift our system is in our last RFP, we devoted twice as many resources. So we went from 30% to 60% going directly to culturally specific community-based organizations as opposed to just culturally responsive agencies, which is something that we require all of our contractors to aspire and work toward being. But the shift meant that we have the opportunity to strengthen those culturally specific agencies and work and learn from them. And so they are the folks in our schools who are employing the P3 coordinators. And they're bringing the expertise of whether it's the Immigrant Refugee Community Organization or the Native American Youth and Family Organization or Latino Network. They're coming into the schools with that knowledge, and they're finding ways that bringing their expertise to meet community needs and to help schools learn from them, which is really exciting to do. And so one of the ways that we want, so that's sort of on the system level, and then we also want to see how best we can support different communities in those schools. And so as part of our requirements, each school runs 2 play and learn groups a week, and we ask that at least one of those be culturally specific or in a language other than English. And so that that's different. We let agencies and schools work together to figure out how best to serve their community, and so that's different across each school. So it might be a Vietnamese play and learn group at Lincoln Park, and then we have a Slavic play and learn group at Sacramento. And again, that's really driven at that school level. And it also, because we're depending on those agencies and their expertise to help promote trust and create a sense of belonging for families of color and culturally specific communities that in many instances are new to that particular part of Multnomah County and may not have that base of support and history that comes with being in a place for a long time. And so as our community changes, I think it's one way that we can provide supports for diverse families. And yeah, it's exciting to see and hear the different ways that plays out. So one really quick example is at one of our schools, Slavic families didn't feel comfortable coming into the building for some complex reasons that I'm happy to tell you the longer story about. But our P3 coordinator wanted to serve that population. And although she's Asian American, she basically hit the pavement, and she went to churches, she met community leaders of the Slavic community. She said, you know, how can we make this happen? How can you come in and do this play and learn group with us? And they really didn't feel ready to be in the school building. So she said, okay, I'll come to you. And so working with one of her Russian-speaking counterparts at her agency, they brought the play and learn group to a community space where that group of families felt welcome and they felt safe. And they built that trust and those relationships. And then a year later, they were able to build on those relationships and say, hey, what do you think? Want to come over to the school this time? And they said, yes, we're ready. And so it's been exciting to see that trust deepening. And even as we see principals change in those buildings, whether it's a community school site manager or a P3 coordinator, they're able to come in and build those trust with families in different ways and create that continuity for families all the way, hopefully, from, you know, their tiny little ones through 5th grade. So.
Oh, that is so neat. Let's talk about those principles. I love that. You alluded to that, and I was like, aha. Yeah, I'd love to know more about what the work is that you do to encourage buy-in from principals. It sounds like not all of them are necessarily on board from day one, but obviously, you know, the work continues and it's important work. So what are the things that you do to maybe work with principals to explain to them the importance of this work. And then obviously there must be some who are probably like gung-ho from the start, you know, so I wonder, you know, how you navigate the, you know, sort of the different turf issues that might arise with this work.
Well, first of all, as a former retired early childhood through elementary school principal, I can really empathize with being a school principal today. There's just a lot of demands. So it's important to enter in that relationship with them, knowing that they have a very difficult, important job role. And all, I believe at the soul that all educators want to do what's best. It's, and there's obstacles that sometimes get in, that are there, they're obstacles, so working around them. I think with principals, I like to kind of pull at their heartstrings. Like, why wouldn't you want to do this? This is what is the right thing to do. But I think it's just really listening to them and then intersecting, navigating my work with them to help address what their goals are, what their wishes are, what their dreams are. Very much like we do with teachers, and very much like we do with parents. What do you envision? What do you hope for? What do you want? And then building that on. But you've got to admit that this thing called birth, prenatal to grade 3 and beyond, is new. And David in the panel before us talked about, you know, yes, there's silos. So the one good thing is that we're breaking down those silos, but we're also entering into areas that I don't know anything about. Now, I was fortunate that I started my career as an early childhood teacher and then moved up and thought, why would I want to do anything other than early childhood? And realized there's a lot to give my fellow colleagues in elementary school. I think I'll enter into that world and share them a little bit about this thing called early childhood. So I think that it's giving them that support that they need. I think that teacher preparation, leadership programs need to really work to embrace that principals need to be birthed through grade whatever in their buildings and look at how to do that. So I know there's different initiatives out there, and I'm excited to see those continue to grow. But individually, or more specifically with our work in Omaha, what we've tried doing is really looking at our theory of change. So we're talking to principals about how to strengthen the organization, their organization, the culture and the climate, the family-school partnership and the community partnership. We're also then talking to them about their building professional development, that capacity. So really looking at their own leadership. What do they need to strengthen themselves as a leader? Their professional development, does it span that age, and the collaboration? And then really looking at the implementation of just really good teaching practices, and how do we then move the teaching practices in our classroom also to include educational opportunities for our families. Bringing data. I happen to love data, and I think data can be our friend, and it can kind of just be a real reality check. When I work with principals and say, hey, let's take a look at your student of color data. And all of a sudden they realize, and we have one principal who, after I kind of prompted that a little bit, he did. I know enough how to nudge and then how to back off. He did, and he came back to me a month or so later, and he goes, you know what, Chris? My office referrals are disproportionately to my student population. I go, tell me more. He goes, they overrepresent my students of color. Tell me more. What do you think is going on? And then what do you think we want to do? What do you think we need to do? And then having them there. So I think that just really meeting it, we've chuckled a little bit as we had conversations earlier. I cannot wait for version 2.0. I think we've learned so much I think sometimes principals struggle. There's this conflict of what they want to do in their buildings and how does that align to their district's initiative? How does that align to their state mandates? And so in version 2.0, I think we need to spend some time really having those conversations at the district level and making sure that we've got the buy-in of the district leaders. We talked about the superintendents. Well, sometimes it's that level, but sometimes it's just the district curriculum coordinators and what we're saying. I think the other thing too, as we work with the principals, is like we're not going to undo your curriculum. We're not going to come in here and say, don't do this for a curriculum, don't do this for an assessment. We want to be able to add value to what you're already doing. We've had some of my and again, I'm seeing all my principals, and they all have strengths and all have individual areas that they really want to get strong in. But I had several principals who made it a goal that they were going to go on home visits. They were going to go see what this thing was. And it was like, oh, okay, I get this now. And then they started having, I've got 2 principals specifically who really want to know and build those partnerships with the community childcare. And like they are starting to have coffees with community childcare, or like, okay, let's see where our kids are coming from. And so that we can start building that. So our principals are key. The leadership of a school is the most important thing, I believe. They set the tone, they give the permission, they give the support for whatever happens. And I think just having them be able to build on their vision and see how this can be part of that vision.
You know, your comment about principals taking time to go out into the communities and visit the child care programs to get an idea of where their children are coming from, you know, leads me to a question, Leanne, and this will be the last question for this panel, and then I'll throw it open to the audience, and you'll get a chance to ask your own questions of everyone who's spoken. But I would love to know more about the work that you all are doing in supporting quality in early childhood centers and in family providers, which I feel is, you know, certainly some underexplored area, but so many kids are there. So tell me about the work that you're doing there.
Well, thank you. I think that is really exciting work. And when David talks about educational equity, this is really the part, this is the crux of it. We don't want children going to subpar programs just because that's what they can afford. So raising the quality of all our programs, including family child care, is really near and dear to my heart. And we decided to tie our program improvement to the Quality Rating Improvement System, our QRIS system in Massachusetts. That was our first decision. And we decided to start with centers. And we started with 9 centers. And what we do is we offer the panoply of services that we know are supportive. You were talking about these things earlier, both of you. We provide coaching twice a month. We provide mentoring for the directors so they can be strong educational leaders. We provide monthly communities of practice. We also provide robust, for us, professional development. For example, we had a PD day April 6th, and we had 129 providers, both family child care and centers, come to 6 workshops. 90% of them were Cambridge providers, so that was great. And we also provide a little thing called program improvement funds. And that's money. And we give money to sites to improve their environment, because environment is, as the workforce development book says, the basis, right? You have to have materials, you have to have your centers, it has to be really interesting. So those are the components that make up the centers. We've been going for David says 3 years, so it feels like yesterday I started, so it's hard for me to remember the date we started. But we've just finished our second year of on-site coaching and programming, and the results that we're seeing are about one in ECRS in class, because we do it annually. ECRS is environmental classes, teacher-child interaction. We're seeing 1 to 2 points improvement. And so that feels good. And so the first year we looked at learning environments, and the second year we looked at curriculum. And the family childcare, we have largely the same program, but because family childcare providers are alone all day long with their children, everything happens at night. And so we provide 5 communities of practice that really strengthen their business practices, 5 professional development workshops that really are looking at developmentally appropriate practice tied to standards, because that's what they asked for. We provide program improvement funds, and we provide really links to the community, because we want them to get out of their house and really attend play groups or other things. And because it's our first year, we're not quite sure what the results will be. We're not tying it to QRIS because they're allergic to QRIS. And, but we do assessment if they want to improve their transitions. We do a pre and a post, and we hope to see change over time.
Sure. Well, this is great. Fantastic panel. We have time for questions from this panel, and also, if there are, and also from our previous panel, Deborah and Kwesi are still here in the audience, and David as well. If there's anybody who wants to ask any questions of anybody who's spoken thus far, just raise your hand and let me know. Yeah, you could just wait for the microphone. There you go.
Great.
Sure, if you don't mind introducing yourself.
I'm Yoli Flores with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, and I wanted to ask Chris specifically about the 2.0 version that you referenced. I just recently read the evaluation in the report that Ralph, my boss, said you got to read this. So it feels like it's on track in the right direction, but now you're moving into 2.0. Wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
Well, and that was probably very premature. Hopefully Dr. Meisels isn't listening to me today. I think the 2.0 is just really, there's nothing out there that has that is planning 2.0. I think in this work we're always evaluating, we're always looking for what lessons learned. So I just hope that as we look to spread our work, to continue doing what we're doing, that we have an opportunity to do some things a little differently. If you want to know one of the things that I would do differently, and it just makes good sense, is just spend some time doing a landscape assessment, really narrowing down where schools are, where districts are, so that we can be very specific to meeting their needs. So that's just one example.
Hi, Lisa Guernsey at New America. This is great. Thank you very much. And thanks to David as well for the report. I wondered, and anybody can jump in on this, as you know, Laura's team here at New America looks at a lot of workforce issues and how to ensure that we're thinking about things like compensation and training and the really big divide that exists between our early childhood educators birth to 3 versus the pay, just quite candidly, that is so much higher, but yet still so low for the K-3 teachers. Does that come up as an issue, maybe in these 3 communities that we're talking about here, and as a barrier to being able to really do this kind of alignment?
I would just jump in and say one of the things that we are doing in Cambridge is providing college courses for free with the textbook, so that an assistant teacher in preschool can become a teacher. And while we can't change the pay structure, although it would be wonderful, we're trying to provide opportunities for people to go up the ladder and therefore increase their pay. I'd say the second thing we're doing is a shared services model that allows teachers to benefit from insurance, telephone plans that are reduced to what they actually pay. So it's kind of, there's no, unfortunately, magic bullet in Cambridge.
In Omaha, in Nebraska, part of the Buffett Early Childhood Institute, one of our units is the workforce development. And we've done some extensive studies and research on that very issue. And there is the Work Commission, part of the legislative branch, is actually working closely with team members of the Buffett Early Childhood Institute to study that and look at, to making a recommendation, to really address, when you think of where a child can be from birth through age, compensatory education, the qualifications and the requirements for all those different settings are all different. And when we think of that continuity and quality, don't you think we might want to have some alignment? And when our most youngest, most developing learners have some of the fewest requirements for their quality of care and continuity, it needs some addressing. So if you want to go onto the Buffett Early Childhood website, and you can see a very comprehensive study that is taking place with that very same.
I can add to one example that I like a lot around the compensation issue. As I mentioned earlier, the Boston Public Schools involvement with the community-based preschools has received a lot of attention nationally. And for the 12 community-based preschools that collaborate with the district and implement the district curriculum, the lead teachers of those community school classrooms get a very significant pay bump. So it's kind of built into that model. And then I would also mention the federal preschool expansion grant program, which is a high quality, provides high quality preschool, also includes teachers, pre-K teacher salaries that are are supposed to match the district salaries.
Great.
We've done studies of districts that have tried to create alignment between pre-K and the early elementary grades, and when we ask what are the challenges, the most important challenge that comes up is the difference in training, and we can't ask people to get more training, more preparation if we don't compensate them for it. So we're sort of stuck with, at least in California, with not very demanding training, and because we don't want to pay them more, or some people don't want to pay them more. The other thing, though, is it's also the difference in the way the jobs are organized. So pre-K teachers are often also doing extended care, so they're with children all day long. So if you want to do even coaching, or if you want to do professional development that brings together the pre-K and the early elementary grade teachers, it's extremely difficult for just simple logistical reasons because they're not available at the same time. So there are a lot of ways we've organized the work differently, as well as the compensation issue.
Okay, I see a gentleman in the back.
Hi, my name is Jerry Reed. I work with David at EDC. And I guess my question is, as I listened to the presentation and the model, I guess what I'd love to understand is, where did you find, when you traveled the country, the greatest proponent of the model? I mean, because there's a lot of new players in the model. And so I'm thinking principals, for example. We spent a little time on that. But where was the strongest ally, and where did you find the strongest resistance to trying something as bold and new as this?
Thanks, Jerry. I think it's a great question. And I think in terms of the second part of your question's easier, which is, I think there is a common denominator that in all of these places, getting the districts to the table is a fundamental challenge. And so we've won over some principals, we've won over some school districts, but I think we're still hoping for deeper involvement from the districts in terms of support. So I think that's something that we're working on. And then in terms of proponents, I think at this early stage of development, we're seeing it different by location. So I think in Metro Omaha, we've seen some principals that have really become champions for this. I think in Cambridge, I think a lot of the work, has been at the directors of the preschools and some of the home visiting programs there. So I think in that sense, it's kind of varied by the location and the emphasis of the work. I mean, what we always say about this work is the importance of champions. And in Cambridge, the outgoing city manager really viewed, so like a mayor, similar to a mayor, he really viewed this as his lasting contribution to the city. He had been worked for decades in the city, but this is the one at the end of his career that he got really excited about, and he went around the city saying early childhood is the most important thing, and what we're doing is now the most important thing we're going to do for the city of Cambridge. And he was a believer, and he's retired, and the superintendent that he brought into that has retired, but the initiative has been sustained throughout a new city manager and a new superintendent.
I see a question in the back.
Sure. I'm Shelley Pasnick. I'm also a colleague of David's. My question is for you, Christine, and how you think about journalism and the coverage of this model. And do you feel like you have the platform to talk about the complexity and the work that it takes to support the kind of change that's described? And then the second part is, do you all feel like you have the tools to amplify the stories that you need to tell, either working with other journalists or other venues?
Thank you. Education Week has a little bit of a different platform from a general interest newspaper because our audience is all K through 12 educators. So in some ways I could say like anything I ever come up with ever related to education will get some readership. I will say though, one thing that we have found, because we can see, who reads our articles and who reads them the most, is that people are particularly interested in like transitions from early childhood to kindergarten. That's where our audience is. Our audience is, they, care about home visiting. I've written about home visiting. It is respectable, but our audience is particularly interested in that transition, which makes sense because our audience is primarily principals and other educators who are going to be looking at it through that lens. In the general interest newspapers, I think that, one of the challenges is that work is very fine-grained. It's not something that one could say like, and then our test scores improved, and then, our school that was on great schools rated 3 is now rated 7, and then, integration happened, which is like a big, anyway, a whole different set of stories there about, different sorts of things going on at school levels. So anyway, I think that, if I were at a general interest newspaper, I would probably be thinking like, okay, so I got to make sure I have like the story here. What am I telling my editor? What is the story? I think the stories are there, but I think that, the challenge, of course, for reporters is that, there's a million stories out there and how to make this one kind of break through. But one thing that is certainly, I think perhaps in the favor is that there's a tremendous amount of interest in I say brain science, this is what we, call it. I think that probably maybe some things are oversold, but anyway, but there's a tremendous amount of interest. There's a tremendous amount of interest in this in the general public. There's a tremendous amount of interest in early childhood in the general public. People just sort of feel like this is an important thing, and so that gives stories like this and the work like this, I think, a lift. That might not have been there in the past as much.
If I could just add to the story, I think social media has taken opportunities to look at the stories that are being shared by parents about how this, the impact of the work that we're doing has changed their lives. So I think capturing those stories and the stories of teachers, how this has changed their life. I have, this is kind of not the same, but when you think of the changes that we're making, it does have impact. I have an educational facilitator who is leaving to become an elementary principal. And this will forever be on her mind, her experience and seeing what can happen. So I think those stories show up in different ways, and people are drawn to them through their own personal, how that talks to them.
So for principals that move to another school, for principals that move to another school, you talked about how principals leave, et cetera. Do they take this with them and continue the initiative where they go? They may not have the same supports, maybe that, but the philosophy, the
Just to share a little bit about, so in the first 2 years of our pilot project, in our original 8 schools, we had 7 of 8 principals turnover during that time. In that same period, we had 1 P3 coordinator turnover. One of those principals was very successful. He got so excited about the model, and he was asked to move to a different school that needed some additional support, and the district thought he would be a good fit there, but he advocated very strongly with the district, and they were able to put together some funds. So we talk about 9, but actually we have a 10th school now, and it was particularly for that reason that we had a principal who was very engaged, who believed in the model, and yelled really loud until the district was able to piece together the funding for that work. So I wouldn't underestimate the power of a committed principal.
I have a principal who is leaving, and he's been part of the project since it started 4 years ago. And so he's moving to within the same district, but in a school that's not a full implementation school as a hub. And so I was asking him, what will you take forward? And he's not going to have a home visitor, a family facilitator, or the instructional coach. But the one thing that he did in his school was start an artifact moment where parents get to bring in a story or an artifact to share the story about their home and their family as part of a parent-teacher conference. And how that really started building that relationship with a family instead of it's usually the teacher talking, where he started that as part of his school as a hub initiative and been building those relationships with family, and he's taking that with him. That's just one little thing that he can do that's not going to cost any money, but there will always be this thing in the back of his head about the 4 years that he experienced with the school as a hub and getting to know his school community that's right there outside his front door.
I hate to do this. This is a great discussion, but we have to wrap it up. Please give a round of applause to all of our panelists. Thank you again.
For a reception. Thank you for coming and ending your day with us.